Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bachelor Bargain by Maddison Michaels. Narrated by Ashford Macnab. Chapter 1. London, April 1885. The pelting rain lashed across Lady Olivia Haliford's cheeks like the icy hands of death, battering the silent tears already coursing down her face without mercy. She stood there, soaked to the bone, her cloak and bonnet sagging after her parasol had long ago conceded defeat against the deluge, to now hang limply beside her cane. But Livy was numb to it all, numb to the cold, numb to the pain, numb to everything but the gleaming walnut of her friend's casket as it slowly lowered into the dark, yawning hole that had been freshly dug into the earth beneath. Alice was dead, and Livy hadn't been able to stop it. She clenched her teeth tightly with the bitter thought, a thought that had been repeating itself over and over in her head since she'd heard the news. The Reverend snapped his Bible closed, finishing his eulogy and jolting Livy from her grim musings. She watched, feeling frozen as the Reverend nodded to one of the caretakers who stepped forward and began shoveling some muddy dirt down upon her friend's coffin. The sound of the mud hitting the wood beneath was jarring in its finality. This was not a nightmare Livy was going to wake up from, as much as she'd been desperately hoping it was. A sense of despair began to penetrate her numbness, and for a minute she couldn't breathe as a tightness gripped her chest, her heart feeling as if it were being squeezed dry. Instinctively, her fingers clenched even more firmly around the silver handle of her cane. "Breathe, Livy, breathe." She inhaled a deep lungful of air, and then another, willing herself to maintain her composure as an overwhelming urge to rage at the heavens threatened to consume her. She mustn't give in to the compulsion. Not here. Not now. She owed it to Alice to refrain from causing any embarrassment. Alice, who had already suffered enough, and was now lying cold and lifeless in that horrid box, forever alone. Was this really her friend's fate? Alice's penance for being seduced and then discarded by an unknown scoundrel, a predator who had surely already moved on to some other unsuspecting young lady, having suffered no consequences for ruining Alice. The injustice of it all was overwhelming, and Livy had to force down the fury trying to bubble to the surface. It was completely unacceptable. Someone had to do something to stop such a thing from occurring again. The fiend, whoever he was, had to be exposed and justice served. Livy glanced first to her right, and then her left. Her two best friends, Lady Caitlin Montrose and Miss Henrietta Merriweather, stood silently beside her. The expressions on their rain-streaked faces surely mirrored Livy's own, equal masks of rage and despair. "This situation is completely intolerable," Livy whispered, loud enough for only her two friends to hear. "We must seek justice for Alice." "I agree." It was Kat who spoke, her jade-green eyes flashing dangerously in the fading afternoon light, almost as wild as the wet strands of the flaming red of her hair peeking out from her bonnet, plastered against the sides of her face. "We cannot let this go unanswered. Alice must be avenged, and the man responsible made to pay." Kat was the fiercest lady Livy had ever met, without exception, caused no doubt by her friend's rather unusual upbringing. She had been raised by an uncle who had extremely liberal views when it came to women and what they should or should not be taught. As he was one of Britain's most elite spy masters, he also believed Cat should be taught all he knew, regardless of the fact that she was female. But Cat's uncle was dead, murdered by an assassin not 6 months past, though the authorities had encouraged the rumour it had been a footpad who had stabbed the Earl. But for those who'd known the man's skills and clandestine occupation, the idea was ludicrous. Not that such a thing was common knowledge, far from it in fact, but the 3 girls, once 4 when Alice had been alive, were the best of friends and knew one another's secrets well. After her uncle's assassination last year, Cat was also on a mission to find his killer, and she had control of her uncle's extensive networks of informants to do so. Livy assumed it would be only a matter of when the assassin was found, not if, and then, God help the fiend. But in the meantime, Livy knew how they could make excellent use of those informants to seek justice for Alice. "What do you propose we do?" Henrietta asked, her warm chocolate-brown eyes fixed firmly on the grave. Etta was the only one of their group not born into the aristocracy, but Livy thought that was a blessing, even though the girl's father obviously disagreed, throwing around a fortune to rectify the situation, much to Etta's disgust. "I propose we find the bastard who seduced and ruined Alice," Livy answered, "and then we ruin him in turn." "We shall not simply ruin him. We shall destroy him," Cat added, her words mirroring Livy's own thoughts. "What exactly do you mean by destroy?" Etta glanced first at Cat and then over to Livy, a look of concern in her gaze. "You do mean take revenge upon him, rather than physically destroying him, don't you?" For a moment there was a grim darkness in Cat's eyes that made Livy pause, but then Cat shook her head, and the expression fled. "As long as he is made to pay for his actions," Cat continued, "then such an extreme measure shouldn't be necessary. Though he must be made to pay, for if it wasn't for his actions, Alice would never have jumped from that tower, and—" "Careful, Cat," Livy said, glancing around, but the mourners had already mostly dispersed, heading for the afternoon tea that Alice's sister, the Countess of Chiltern, was hosting after the funeral. "There's speculation enough surrounding Alice's death. Though the authorities may have ruled it an accident, we all know what her death truly was." Cat's voice was flat. "A suicide?" "Well, we don't actually know that for certain." Etta spoke up before biting her lower lip in the usual manner she did when upset. "Just because that is the current whispered rumour, for all we know, it could well have been an accident. It was raining that night. Perhaps in Alice's distressed state she wandered too close to the edge of the roof and slipped." Livy had thought of nothing else for the past several days, other than what the last terrifying moments of Alice's life had been like. To first be seduced and abandoned by a scoundrel, and then to fall to her death was heinous. But one thing of which Livy was certain was that it was neither an accident nor a suicide. In truth, Livy believed Alice had been murdered. Especially after receiving a letter from Alice on the day of her death, where Alice had alluded to moving to the Americas and making a fresh start of everything. Alice had seemed positive and upbeat, certainly not like someone contemplating taking her own life. Though Livy was not prepared to share the letter or her suspicions of Alice being murdered with her friends just yet. At least, not until she had more definitive proof. All 3 of the ladies fell into silence for a moment, as they watched more dirt being flung into the grave. I feel absolutely wretched she didn't come and talk to us about it, Etta mumbled, fresh tears streaming down her face. I was too busy with my writing that I neglected to even notice something was amiss. We all feel guilty, Etta. Livy placed a hand on her friend's shoulder and drew in a shaky breath. For it was true. The four of them had been the very best of friends since meeting at the finishing school they'd all been sent to when they were younger. But in the last few years they'd each become so busy with their own lives, they hadn't stayed in as much contact as they'd all vowed they would. We were too late to do anything while she was alive, but we will not rest until we ensure that the scoundrel who ruined Alice is uncovered and punished for his actions. We will stop him and expose him before he's able to seduce another young lady and destroy her life as he did Alice's. For too long, Livy had retreated as far as she could from society, burying her head in books, unwilling to face the taunts and cruelty from her peers and the veiled glances of sympathy and intolerance that her limp seemed to elicit. Even after all these years. Well, she was done caring about what others thought. If she'd been braver sooner, she would have noticed what was happening to Alice, and she would have been able to help her. But how are we to seek justice when we don't even know who the man is? Etta asked, swiping away some of the tears still tracking down her cheeks. We must discover his identity, Livy replied, raising her eyes directly to Cat. Cat's green gaze narrowed in understanding, and she nodded. I will get my informants to begin making inquiries immediately. Thank you, Livy said, though I don't wish to take away any of your resources in trying to discover who the assassin was who killed your uncle. There are more than enough informants in Victor's network to reallocate some toward finding the bastard responsible for Alice's demise. Cat's voice brooked no argument as she straightened her shoulders to stand tall, her 5'9" towering next to both Etta's and Livy's rather average statures, though it would assist if we had a short list of suspects to start with. I will meet with Lady Chiltern and see what I can discover, Livy said, her eyes straying to the far side of the cemetery where Alice's sister was seeing off the various mourners and presumably thanking them for attending. Good, Cat replied. Once we have a list, we can discover who the scoundrel is and all of his dirty little secrets. But then what? Etta asked. How will we stop him from ruining another young lady? Livy adjusted her left leg, trying to ease the slight cramp that had gripped it before standing straighter herself. We will ruin him, just as he ruined Alice. We shall reveal his secrets to the world. And if he did kill Alice, then he would spend the rest of his life in a rat-infested prison. But why would society listen to us? Etta asked. You know we're considered oddities. What Etta said was true. Even though Livy was the daughter of a duke, in the eyes of society, her lame leg made her disabled and considered definitely not marriageable material. If it weren't for her father's position, or for her godmother's iron influence on society, Livy would have never been tolerated. And though Cat was the daughter and niece of earls, her lack of artifice and her bluntness had marked her as someone to be wary of, hence why no one would dare cut either of them. Then there was Etta, whose father owned the largest newspaper in all of England, a man who none would dare slight for fear of being shredded to pieces in the pages of his paper. So Etta, like Livy and Cat, was acknowledged but never properly accepted, seemingly always on the periphery. Probably why they'd been drawn to one another at school, for none of them had fit into what society considered normal. So, no, their peers probably wouldn't listen if they began to speak the truth about a gentleman, especially as each of them was considered firmly on the shelf. But society would listen if those truths were printed by an anonymous source. After all, there was nothing society loved better than gossip, and gossip in the form of scandal would be zealously consumed. Livy glanced at both women. "We are going to enter the publishing arena, my friends, and start an anonymous monthly gazette dedicated to exposing the nefarious bachelors of society and all their dirty little secrets." "Oh, Livy," gasped Etta, her eyes twinkling in delight. "That is brilliant. Society will flock to it like a moth to a flame, and it will make those no-good bounders think twice before ruining another young lady." "It certainly will." Cat nodded in agreement. "The Gazette will have one mission, and one mission only." Livy took a breath as the idea solidified in her head. "To expose the men in society who seek to deceive and exploit those weaker than themselves. We will all ensure their secrets and scandals are aired for one and all to read about in detail. For too long, the bachelors in society have been able to get away with seducing and ruining ladies at their leisure with no consequences. Well, no longer. Let us give them a dose of their own medicine. We will seek justice, not only for Alice, but for all those women who have been used and discarded like rag dolls." A slow smile spread across Cat's face, a rare occurrence on her friend's more often than not serious countenance. The gentlemen in society didn't call Cat the Ice Maiden for nothing. "You're a genius, Livy," Cat said. Livy's lips twisted up as the idea took shape. "Indeed, there will be nowhere they can hide, nowhere they can run. When we're finished with them, they'll dare not show their faces in society again." "Justice for Alice," Etta seconded. "But what about the cost of starting such an endeavour?" Though Etta was the writer in the group, she was also the most practical of the three of them, especially when it came to finances. "Even a small gazette will take a lot of capital to start up, considering none of us has any independent funds, apart from our pin money, which certainly won't be enough to start up a publishing endeavour. How will we afford it?" Taking in a deep breath, Livy glanced to the grave again and made up her mind. She'd known it would cost a lot to implement her idea, but she also knew of a potential source who had ample funds to assist them. An extremely dangerous source. But seeing Alice's coffin solidified in her mind that something had to be done to seek justice for her friend. Whatever it took. "Leave it to me. I know who has the blunt and the temerity to invest in such an endeavour. I need only convince him." "Who are you going to approach?" Cat asked. Livy straightened her shoulders. She'd never kept secrets from her friend before, and now she would be keeping two from them. But even Cat herself, who was the most unconventional woman Livy knew and could amply protect herself from threats, would think twice before approaching a man some called the most dangerous in all of London. "Please don't ask me that, for it is a name I cannot reveal just yet. I'm asking you both to trust me. Please." "Of course we trust you, Livy," Cat replied, her eyes narrowing, whether in concern or misgivings. Livy wasn't certain. "But you do tend to believe the best in others when you probably shouldn't. And, to be honest, I can't think of a single gentleman who would be happy to fund a gazette solely focused on destroying the reputations of other gentlemen. Trust me, that will not be a problem. Because the man Livy intended to ask was no gentleman at all. No, the bastard of Baker Street was said to hail from the devil himself. Chapter 2. London, May 1885. Sebastian Culver, the bastard of Baker Street, or the king of the rookeries, depending on who you asked, carefully folded up the note before he strode back to his desk and placed it on the polished mahogany surface. He was deliberate to maintain his usual air of outward nonchalance, even though the two men seated in the chairs across from his desk were men he trusted. Well, as trusted as Seb would ever allow anyone to be. Life had taught him the hard way that one could never fully trust anyone. So, as usual, he kept his thoughts to himself and sat in his brown leather upholstered chair, even though inwardly his curiosity had been stirred greatly by the letter. A rare occurrence nowadays, especially after all Seb had seen and done. But this woman, who would clearly not take no for an answer, as she'd plainly enunciated in her latest letter, was certainly rousing it. Greatly. It had been a long time since anyone had dared question his decisions. He didn't know if this Lady Olivia was daft or simply as stubborn as a mule. Perhaps both. He leaned back against the comfortable padding that had been sewn into his custom-made chair and glanced to both of his men, determined to get his mind back to business instead of the persistent woman. "How are we going with the Bunkerton deal?" Seb looked to Lance Tantor, his second in charge, and a man more like a brother to him than simply a childhood friend and employee. "The owner is trying to play hardball, but he'll sign the contract later today. Of that, I have no doubt," Lance answered, confidence radiating from his gaze. "You will own Bunkerton's shares in his railroad before nightfall." "Good. And what about you, Rowan?" Seb glanced over to the younger man seated next to Lance, his head buried in an accounts ledger. "Are we on track for the Fullerton Hotel buyout?" "The numbers are good." Rowan Drake spoke without looking up, his pencil flying across the page as he continued to tally figures. "And I've sent the contract over to the solicitor for a last check." His hand paused on the page, and he raised his eyes briefly to Seb's. "Pending that, I imagine you'll add it to your growing portfolio of hotels by the end of the week." The news didn't fill Seb with the usual sense of satisfaction it once would have, which was disconcerting, particularly as his business empire was what he lived for. Or, at least, it had been. "Has there been any more trouble on the wharfs?" Seb was talking about a new gang that had recently popped up in the rookeries, who called themselves the Lads of Laybrook Lane, and had caused a bit of trouble for his men. Nothing they all weren't used to. After all, when there were those who had power as Seb did, there were always others who tried to take that power. Not that Seb had any intention of allowing anyone to do so. "Nothing our men can't handle," Lance answered. Seb had anticipated as much, though it was best to stamp out the issue before it became a real problem. "And have our informants discovered the leader's identity yet?" Lance's jaw tensed as he leaned forward in his chair, his hands fisting by his sides. "Not yet. But when I find out who the wretch is, I promise you I'll personally ensure his body never surfaces from the Thames." His friend had always been particularly protective over their territory in the rookeries, and took it as a personal affront that any man, would dare try to usurp Seb's, and by proxy Lance's, authority. And though this new gang was more of a bother than a true threat, they did seem to be more organised and zealous than others he had quashed in the past, which was why Seb had tasked Lance with discovering the leader's identity, a fact that was so far proving rather elusive to uncover, and was obviously frustrating Lance to no end. "Well, when you do find out his name, consult with me first before doing anything. Understood?" Seb stared steadily at Lance until he reluctantly nodded. "I will, but you know a strong message will have to be sent to deter others from following suit," Lance replied. "You can't treat such a threat within the bounds of the law, as you are now trying to do with your businesses." "I know." And Seb did, for as much as he had made the company and all of his businesses as legitimate as he could, there were still unavoidable aspects of his businesses that couldn't be masked behind the doors of supposed respectability. He was still king of the rookeries, and he still had to maintain order in his streets, and the only real way of doing so was with force and fear, a fact Seb had learned well over the years. His response seemed to placate Lance, who sat back, releasing his clenched fists as his eyes darted over to the folded note on Seb's desk. "Is the lady still demanding an audience with you?" There was a note of unbridled curiosity in his friend's voice. Lance was nothing if not nosy about Seb's life, and especially perceptive, only to be expected after they'd grown up together on the streets, each having the other's back in many precarious situations over the years. "Yes," Seb confirmed. "A tenacious little thing, isn't she?" Lance's mouth twitched up at the corners. "Isn't that the 5th letter she's sent you this past fortnight?" "The 6th, actually," Seb replied, careful to maintain a bland face. As much as he trusted Lance, Seb didn't want him to realize just how curious this lady was making him. "I didn't know you were keeping track." Lance shrugged. "When has a real lady ever sent you a letter, let alone persisted in doing so, all in an effort to meet with you? I'm intrigued, to be honest." So was Seb, but he stayed silent. "Why don't you just agree to see her?" Lance suggested. "If she wants to risk her reputation by meeting with you, then who cares? It's her own good name on the line, after all, not yours." "He's too busy to deal with some bored society miss who won't take no for an answer." Rowan spoke, leaving his head still firmly buried in the accounts book as he continued with his task. "Besides, the lady's brother is one of Seb's partners in an investment, so he won't wish to jeopardize that, no matter how curious he might be." Rowan's ability to add numbers and still follow a conversation was a trait that continually impressed him, and had, since Seb had rescued Rowan from the streets when the boy was only 10 years old. Even then, it had been readily apparent that Rowan was an intelligent lad, which was why Seb had taught him to read and write, and in doing so recognized the boy had a gift for numbers. A gift Seb had made great use of. With Rowan now in charge of overseeing the account portfolios of Seb's numerous investments and business endeavours, and considering Rowan was only 26, having the bastard of Baker Street's confidence in matters of finance was a feat no one else had achieved. Even Lance, who Seb had known for 25 years, since they were boys of 8, wasn't privy to Seb's accounts. A fact which had been a bone of contention initially, as Lance had been Seb's right-hand man since Seb had become the leader of the Baker Street boys' gang when they were 14. But, eventually, Lance had come to accept Rowan's gifts, especially as using them had almost immediately increased profits in the organisation tens of times over, which benefited Lance too, after Seb had turned the organisation legitimate and listed his companies on the London Stock Exchange, making them all a fortune in the process. "I did do a little bit of digging on the lady, though, as you asked, Seb," Rowan said, pausing in his calculation.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?